The NA LCS caster Jatt is one of my favourite casters in esports, certainly one of my favourite colour commentators in esports. And at the outset of this video, I want to point out very simply, casters do make mistakes when they're live on air. Sometimes, not even real mistakes, it's just a slip of the tongue. What they say doesn't come out the way they'd ideally want it to be. If they'd been writing it, they'd backspace it, they'd think it over, they'd phrase it a little differently. But you got to go with it in the moment. You got to embrace what you're saying. You got to hope that later on you can fix things or it's not a big deal and you continue on. Now, I'm not making this video to kind of like crush Jatt and to wreck him and really like rip him open and ream the shit out of him and show that like, oh yeah, what an idiot, oh, he doesn't know anything, oh, what a piece of shit. No, none of that. Rather, the real point of this video is to highlight some specific instances where I think Jatt made a choice to either be a little bit ignorant or kind of a bit disingenuous with how he presented something, or just refused to be entirely, bluntly reasonable in his analysis when it came to comparing regions or talking about things that go against the consensus of what Western fans like. And so this all culminates in this key flashpoint that we've had come up a couple of times over the Jatt Dilemma. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with what the Jatt Dilemma is, I'm going to go into it at length in this video, obviously. The Jatt Dilemma is a little fun segment, a theme that popped up again and again, a trope on Summoning Insight, the talk show that I do with Monte Cristo, which is a show about League of Legends, the competitive scene around the world, all the different regions. And the concept behind this little theme, this little recurring segment, was to present a scenario where it was kind of a cognitive dissonance, where on one hand, the person I'm labeling as Jatt thought one thing about a Western region, could be EU, could be NA. They thought one thing positively about them, and then I tried to take the same mechanism of logic that they used in that area, and they spun in a positive way, and then apply it to usually an Asian region, but sometimes NA versus EU, for example, when they're the antagonist, and apply the same logic, but come up with what ends up being ultimately kind of a pessimistic or a cynical or a negative perspective, yet using the same logic. And so the cognitive dissonance here is because the person likes NA or the Western region, depending on which is the protagonist in this particular sense, they're using the same logic for two different ends, which obviously shouldn't work. And therefore, I presented it as kind of the dilemma. And I used Jatt as the figurehead for this. And the dilemma obviously is, how does he resolve this in his own mind that he thinks these two things at once? Now, first of all, again, it was a small segment on a talk show, but it caught on. People referenced it a bunch of times. I think I don't know if people say it in Twitch chat. I don't read Twitch chat, but I know people have said it on Reddit over the years. And I know that Jatt got upset by this, didn't like it, actually was actually like mildly annoyed by it in a private sense, and publicly has had a couple of instances where he's referenced it and said he didn't like it. And so one key one, and I'll link down below to where he linked this, was a twitlonger, where he said, where it was called Explaining the Jatt Dilemma, and Jatt Dilemma was in inverted commas. So he said, "Glory, hallelujah, I woke up today to a thread being titled, Freak Embracing the Jatt Dilemma, sitting at #1 on Reddit." And then he links to the Reddit thread. "Before I get into the content of the post, I need to explain something about the aforementioned Jatt Dilemma. Even at the time of the Jatt Dilemma that was linked, Monty says, Jatt never said any of that. Because guess what? It's all fabricated." I mean, this is me now talking. It's not all fabricated, which I'm going to get to, but I know what he means by that, so we'll continue on. "I would appreciate it if the Jatt Dilemma died. I don't say the things that are attributed to my name and then used to sully my reputation. I have never said C9 was the strongest team at Worlds because they went 25-3. Likewise, I have never said an EU team is far weaker than NA because they couldn't beat their own region." Pause a second. By the way, no one in the Jatt Dilemma, even the one he linked to, ever said C9 was best team at Worlds. Right, go back. "It's always dependent on context. Back in 2013, I did say that C9 was looking strong and was far and away the best team in NA, because they were, and they were NA's greatest hope at Worlds. I also said that Fnatic, relative to their region, wasn't as strong as C9, which was 100% true. They had to fight through regular and season and playoffs, but never did I say that C9 was definitively stronger than EU because they dominated their region and Fnatic didn't. Now, on to the rest of the post. Let's see here. All right, the rest is just about people thinking NA is biased. So, okay, to set some things straight and to give you all the evidence, so you can look at all the links, etc. When the original Jatt Dilemma came up, was actually in response to an interview segment that was with Jatt, not done by me, done with Travis actually when he was at On Gamers on his like the set or whatever it was called. So the original Jatt Dilemma, which I'll link up here, is completely different. And here's the premise of what the original Jatt Dilemma, if you've now gone and watched that, is referring to, which is the video I'm going to now link here, which is the interview Jatt did with Travis. And in the interview, he just throws in there, he says, and I've got the quote here, I've transcribed it. One interesting thing, right? By the way, this takes place late 2013, early 2014. Well, it must be early 2014 when SK Telecom has gone 15-0 and won the winter season of OGN for season 3, going into season 4. And here's his quote. One interesting thing, and this is just a random thought. When you're trying to compare the overall strength of leagues, I look at OGN, SK, let's see, SK's dominance over there, he means in OGN, as ridiculously impressive, because OGN is by and large considered the strongest league in the world, because it generally is. I'm fucking this up. But if a team can go 18-0 and not drop a single game, how strong are the other teams in that league? Obviously, SKT is like the pinnacle of play right now, but is the league really so perfect if no one could take a game off SKT? Now, the point that we're going to make here, okay, that part there, you can see how essentially he did do what I kind of set up in the Jatt Dilemma, which is the idea that when this region is very strong and they're dominant, he kind of just spins it. Like, sure, he says they're impressive, he says it's a very hard league to dominate, all the rest of it, but then he spins it that, you know, it's all the angle of like, well, how tough could the league be? How good could those teams be? Now, he does kind of like back away from it a bit within his own comment there, if you go beyond the bit that I quoted, if you keep listening to the video, by saying stuff like that, other teams aren't perfect and can't be perfect, and it can't be a perfect league. Now, that itself is kind of a straw man, because who said it was a perfect league? Who said that all the teams in it are perfect? No, but what we might be implying is, most of us who thought the Korean League was very strong might imply that the other teams in the league are also better than the Western teams, and therefore SKT is even better that they're dominating these teams. The opinion that most people I know actually share. And he seems to be arguing against. Like, he's arguing that SK Telecom be very, very strong, but the other teams there's some level of weakness. They're not as strong, they're not as good as we maybe think they are. That's the implication, at least, being carried by this. Now, first and foremost, a key point to make here is, obviously, Korea was incredibly strong at the time. That's why I don't understand why he presented that particular argument. Like, I get the basic point, but I felt like he went a bit too hard with it, or he thought it was saying more than it really was, and then backpedaled away from part of it at the end anyway. Because if you think of that season of OGN, that was the season where famously all the really good teams got put on SK Telecom's side of the bracket. So KTB was the team that should have gone to Worlds, but couldn't because of how the circuit point system worked, was incredibly strong, probably the second best team in the world at the time, very good even against SK Telecom, even though they lost 3-0, it was one of those very, very close 3-0s if you go and watch it, and SK Telecom, in my opinion, the best team of all time, that particular lineup, and they took them very close. Then you had the Neo Blaze lineup, the one that had Daydream and it had Emperor, and they were really in like a resurgence of form. They'd won the World Cyber Games qualifier, they won World Cyber Games. This season, when they got knocked out in the first round of the playoffs because they had to play KTB, the second best team in the first round of the playoffs, they go into NLB and win that with ease. So they were very strong. Ozone made the final from the other side of the bracket. Weren't very strong, admittedly, but they were very solid still. They still wouldn't get beaten by any teams that weren't elite. Probably would have not lost to any of the other teams except SK Telecom, KTB, and maybe Blaze. And obviously, famously, they had a good matchup against Blaze. Shield was really up and coming and was like very close to kicking into the form that they went into the next season when they went to the finals. And Zenix was a dangerous outsider, which had players who went on to help revitalize teams like Frost and so on. So, first and foremost, when we talk about this particular aspect, the reason why I set this up is because it seems to me like Jatt explaining that point, which, by the way, the point in isolation about Korea isn't unreasonable. It is maybe because of the implication that it carries from it, like with the premise of what opinion he's kind of arguing against, or what he's trying to make a point that is unique that the rest of us wouldn't know about. That in itself, I think, carries some slightly dodgy connotations to kind of downplay Korea a little bit. But the problem is, the reason why I feel it's disingenuous is because he downplayed Korea like that, yet in a scenario like Cloud9 being incredibly dominant and going actually 30-3, obviously over their whole playoffs and regular season, in summer season of season 3 in NALCS, when they're incredibly dominant there, you don't really hear him making lots of comments about how the rest of the league must be not very good, or like if this is, well, and the reasonable way to do the same argument about NA would be, well, we know NA is traditionally a much worse region actually than Korea, and if the teams here, even the third and fourth best teams, can't even come close to being able to beat this top level team, and they've only lost 3 times out of 33 games, then actually they're good, but how terrible must NALCS be? He would never make a point like that, and he didn't make any points like that. So my point is that, to me, that in itself, if you're trying to be very, very specific, is kind of a dilemma, how he can think those two things, how he can think that about Korea, the very strong region, but then doesn't take the same kind of rationale and reasoning and then apply it to Western regions where there's massive amounts of dominance. And so, for example, he did a video, which I'm going to link here, which was called his Jatt 22, which obviously that, by the way, in itself, Jatt, didn't help you. That you then made a scenario called Jatt 22, which is reference to Catch 22, where a guy was in kind of a crazy dilemma, where obviously he was trying to prove that he was crazy to get out of the army, but he couldn't quite do so, and therefore he's stuck in the army. But he's trying to. So what's funny is you've in a weird way. I don't know who thought that name up. You're almost. Everyone thought this at the time, referencing the Jatt Dilemma, but you've changed the name and made it your own feature, so you're almost associating it with yourself. Now, I like that. Own it. Just take it and go, fuck it, and here's what I think, and here's what I'm going to set up as an interesting thought. But don't then complain that people keep referencing it after that when you've also made a feature like that. So he did a feature like that when Fnatic went 18-0. Remember when they won the regular season? Now, they obviously didn't go undefeated in the playoffs, because that was the one where they got into the finals and played a very close series against Origin. But obviously, yeah, they were undefeated until the finals. Now, what's funny is he did not make a similar kind of point here about EU, because, by the way, EU was clearly the best in terms of Fnatic being the most dominant team in the West at the time. He didn't, in this scenario, make a similar point about EU and about how the rest of the teams must be weak and how a third best team like HQK must be very weak if they can't win any games against Fnatic. And so, also, EU then provided us an opportunity to actually look at what his point about Korea and ask how much validity is there. Now, there's a little bit of validity. Obviously, they can't be the perfect teams, but in a more general sense, obviously, the next season of OGen, incredibly competitive. Obviously, that season of OGen, some very, very good teams. It's just that the best team of all time played in that era and had a good matchup against their rivals, KTB, who had a good matchup against Blaze. So we never got some of the matchups that might have been more interesting. Now then, with Fnatic went 18-0, then went over to Worlds. Now, Fnatic dominate their league, didn't lose a game in the regular season. So did EULCS turn out to be weak? Well, no. Fnatic and Origin both finished top 4 at the World Championship, something a team like Cloud9 never did. And obviously, fantastic result, and showed that actually Fnatic just was incredibly good, and EULCS as a league was good as well at the same time. And it wasn't a scenario where it was one or the other, and there wasn't a dilemma in that particular sense. Now then, with that said, the problem here is when he talks about the Cloud9 example and the Fnatic example, that's not actually the original instance of the Jatt Dilemma, obviously, as I mentioned with the video that I've linked here. So, I will point out that, as he mentions in his post, the things that were said in the Jatt Dilemma, let me think, where's the other Jatt Dilemma? Okay, I'll link another Jatt Dilemma here, because it's the video that actually came from, how have I lost this one? Okay, so I'll link a video in here now, because there was another Jatt Dilemma later, and people often link to this and think it's the first one. Now, this one comes from, actually, wait a second, yeah, how am I getting lost with this? Where was that? Where was his other Jatt Dilemma? Oh, yeah, that's right. So the original Jatt Dilemma, how many times am I going to say that, by the way? But okay. Let's see, was obviously actually about NA versus EU, but it wasn't this specific one. Oh no, it was about SK Telecom. That's right, yes. The original Jatt Dilemma was about SK Telecom's strength, and then I tried to contrast it against, I think it was Cloud9 in this particular sense, right, and how they're very dominant. So, aside from the SK Telecom example, yes, as Jatt said, it was not literally what he said in that video. Like, that wasn't in there. Now, first and foremost, it was a comedic segment. As you can tell by the way I presented it, it was thought up on the spot on a talk show in which everything is unscripted and everything said is entirely promptu. We don't even have show notes or any set topics we're going to discuss. We just go through stuff, and whatever comes to mind we talk about. Therefore, any jokes might be funny but impromptu. They might be off the cuff. None of them are going to be set up in any particular way. No one's given any thought to what's said. So first of all, it was comedy. Secondly, the actual concept behind what I was saying was a vehicle to express how casters, not necessarily Jatt, but to some degree, as you're seeing from some of my explanations in this video, yeah, he does display some of this type of thinking. It's a vehicle to kind of express a line of caster reasoning or thinking that I'm not really a fan of, because I feel like it's disingenuous when you contrast the regions. Again, on a talk show. Now, it's not like I made a Thorin's thoughts on that particular topic like I'm doing now. It's not like I wrote an article saying he's like totally biased and he's a liar and all that. Didn't do any of that stuff. It was mainly entertainment, and I was trying to make a point. And then thirdly, the point I was making was actually, the original Jatt Dilemma was a setup to a question which posed a similar premise to Monte Cristo about, now that SK Telecom were in the spring season of OGN in 2014, which was probably the most parity ever in Korea. Now in that world where there's so much parity in Korea, I tried to present a similar scenario. So which is it? Is the league not as good? Is the league even more good? That they're all battling each other and so many good teams? And I did it in a comedic manner, and then he gets to respond to it. Fourthly and finally, he had said similar things about each of these teams earlier, which, by the way, he actually states in his own twitlonger. It's just that he didn't, in the case of NA and EU, directly connect them in the absurd manner I did, where I've taken his premises and his points, and I have reduced them to absurdity and then made them ridiculous to show how ludicrous it would be if you tried to resolve this cognitive dissonance, because it just show how ridiculously biased you seem to NA in that particular scenario. Now then, with that said, I did that for effect. It was a talk show. Now, people then usually link to a different video, which is the one that he actually even might have linked to. I can't remember. Maybe it was in the thread, which was another Jatt Dilemma, which actually came when Forgiven was on the show. The other one was when Mithy was on the show. This one was when Forgiven was on the show. The other one was from season 9 of something. I forget which episode. This one was maybe 41 or something. Was in spring of 2015, that season, where SK Telecom had got SK Gaming in Europe, almost pulled a Dustin Beck there. Had in spring of 2015, SK was 15-3 in the regular season, and TSM was 13-5. But people in the West tried to argue that TSM was stronger, using the similar type of logic that I brought up again, which is what you'll see in the video there that we reference, which is the scenario. And again, I use him because it's a vehicle at that point in time. It's a joke, and we bring that up again. And at the end, Monty, as Jatt himself says, Jatt did not say that, and I say, yeah, well, obviously it's a joke, isn't it? And so, with that said, there are other instances that I want to bring up now. And so, there was a thread that Jatt did, I'll link this below as well, it was like a twitlonger, where it was called Criticism of Riot. And let me skip through. And he essentially indirectly references some things here. But these are things actually that he references that came from my Twitter. And there's another thing that I criticized him over, which is about him and Pawn and Yasuo at the Season 4 World Championship. So I'll skip to the relevant part. It says, I was reading the Reddit thread for my latest Jatt 22 segment, and I saw a decently upvoted post that basically said, Jatt says random things about Korean and Chinese teams, like that time he said Pawn wasn't known for his Yasuo, when that was the only champ every single team was banning against him during the whole split. End of quote. I responded to it in the thread, but also wanted to copy/paste it here for full context from the thread. The whole Jatt said Pawn is not known for his Yasuo. Yes, I said that, because Pawn wasn't known for his Yasuo at the time. I also never said Pawn was bad at Yasuo. At the time, Pawn had played Yasuo one time in the entire Champion Summer season. Also, when Samsung White played Samsung Blue, White banned Yasuo in every game. White, by the way, was Pawn's team, and Blue was Darde's team, because remember, they'd switched roles, they'd switched teams. White banned Yasuo in every game against Darde, who I referenced as the more threatening Yasuo player at the time, which based on enemy bans and play rate was absolutely accurate. Most of the misconceptions stem from this tweet 1 year ago, which I'll now just read out quickly for you, which is a tweet from me, where I said, good job D-Man and Pawn told D-Man and Jatt told us Pawn isn't really a Yasuo player. I mean, Blue themselves only banned it versus him in the semis. Now, so Jatt addresses that. What's interesting about this is him again. What's interesting about this is Thorin claims that Blue themselves banned it versus him in the semis, which isn't true. If you check when Samsung White played Samsung Blue in the actual semi-finals of Champions Summer, White actually banned it away from Darth in all 4 games. Pawn had also played Yasuo one time in the 2nd/3rd place tiebreaker match versus SK Telecom, in which he was victorious. Anyways, I pride myself on my prep for League of Legends events ever since I began casting in Season 2, and it's frustrating to me when people bash on my prep and knowledge of the scene. Please fact check. If I am wrong about something, I will admit it and have in the past. And then he puts, I rewatched the VOD at the moment, I talked about it, and I could have delivered the points more clearly. Based on the history at the time, though, I don't exactly think it proved, I say, random stuff about Korean and Chinese teams. End of Reddit post. Now, first and foremost, I've never said he says random things about that. That's the general public he's referring to. But this specific example of what he's talking about, of the Pawn not being a Yasuo player. So, okay, here's what happens. I'll set up the context. So, and in Jatt's twitlonger, by the way, there'll be like a link to where it is in the VOD. So what was happening was, I think it was EDG was playing against Samsung Blue. Could it be Samsung Blue? That doesn't make sense. How could it be Samsung Blue? No, it must be Samsung White, obviously, because Pawn plays. Yeah, I got confused myself there. So EDG was playing against Samsung White. If you remember, that was Group A of Season 4 Worlds. And D-Man was talking about the bans. And he said something like EDG had banned Yasuo 31 times in China. D-Man then said, of course, that isn't against a lot of Chinese mid laners. Of course, that isn't against a lot of Chinese mid laners. Yasuo is a big threat there. Pawn, not so much. Now, first of all, you can obviously argue the semantic argument of like, well, which way you're going with it there of threat. Like, is he a threat to pick it, or is he a threat on the champion? Yeah, you can go with all that, because obviously Pawn's a massive threat on Yasuo, but D-Man's right, as we're going to go into here, and as Jatt stated, he's not a threat to pick it, actually, interestingly enough, because he hadn't been picking it recently. Jatt then follows up, it's kind of the wrong Samsung if you're looking for a Yasuo player. And then they say that Pawn and you trend more towards passive laners. Now, first and foremost, obviously, if we're talking about just as a Yasuo player, yes, Pawn very much is a Yasuo player, was at one point in time considered like a mad one trick on the champion, was very well known in Korea for it. In NLB Winter, in the 3rd/4th match versus Zenix in Game 3, he has this insane body bag game when he was on Blue, where he goes 12-1-4. In OGN Spring, obviously this is after summer when we're talking about Worlds, but at Spring, he went 6-0 on it. He picked it 3 times in the 3rd place match against Blaze, including the blind pick. It was banned in one of the other games. In Masters, a similar time period in the spring, he played it twice. At Worlds, he ended up over the whole tournament playing it twice. It's just that he didn't pick it much due to the personnel on White once he switched over to White. And likewise, it wasn't banned for similar reasons, because he wasn't actually a threat to pick it. Now, as on the actual champion, and as a Yasuo player, certainly he's a Yasuo player. And that's actually quite an important point to make. Like, here's what's funny. In what I've just broken down there, Jatt and D-Man aren't necessarily 100% wrong. It's just that I don't think the context is reasonable. And for presenting it to people who are total neophytes and don't know this stuff about Korea, I don't think they did a very good job there. Let me just put it that way, okay? And it certainly comes off as though they don't know what they're talking about necessarily. Now, what's funny is, obviously you don't have unlimited time to break it down like I just did, but if you could have given some of the information I just gave at the end there, which is that Pawn is very much known as a Yasuo player. He's a massive threat if he's on the champion, but used to play it a lot when he was on Blue and be incredible on it, but since he switched to White, he doesn't really play it, and he's barely played it in the recent times. As a result, he's not a threat to pick it, even though he's very good on it. Therefore, maybe EDG don't need to use a ban, because they're using bans in China because people will pick it. It's a very popular champion there, and in fact, then you can mention the other. If you're looking for someone who's going to pick who's the threat to pick Yasuo, that would be Darth on the other Samsung. So in a sense, they're not totally off base, but I think actually this would be a better way to explain it in terms of context. Now, with that said, maybe you don't have enough time to do all that, but if we're going to argue the details of it as they want to, apparently, then this is what we're talking about. Now then, with that said, I will definitely come out and say I was absolutely wrong in my tweet. By the way, most of those tweets I was doing at like 5 a.m. in the morning after drinking loads of fucking rock stars, just staying up watching the games. I used to do a talk show after each day's games with on-gamers. Also, interesting enough, the same scenario in which I made that Wild Turtle tweet. Now then, in this scenario, the facts are that I was absolutely wrong. In OGN Summer, it was actually White who banned it themselves against Blue because Darde was the more threatening Yasuo player. So in OGN Summer, Yasuo was banned in 0 out of 17 games versus White. So he wasn't even, Pawn was not a threat to pick the champion. White themselves banned it in all 4 games against Blue in the OGN Summer semi-finals. They only picked it once in all of Summer, which was against SK Telecom S, which was the Marin Easyhoon lineup. In the third place decided, despite the fact it was left open a bunch of times, they didn't pick it in those other ones. And it's true, Pawn was overshadowed on Yasuo by Darde, because Darde was even better on Yasuo and was absolute god on the champion. Now then, let me think. He did clarify all this in a twitlonger, and let me think. And essentially, yeah, we've got all this here. So, as I said, this was a comment. Here's a key distinction, though, between me and Jatt in this scenario. My comment is a throwaway, just stream of consciousness thought on Twitter at God knows what time in the morning watching some games. And that's in that scenario, I'm more like a fan. I'm not making some official statement that's part of my work. Jatt is on the broadcast actually talking to the viewers and for posterity throughout all of time. So if you go back and watch that VOD, you're going to think, Pawn's maybe not even a good Yasuo player then. Maybe he's not even a threat if he plays it, if they let him get it in that sense. Whereas actually the real context, which I think unfortunately D-Man and Jatt failed to explain, is that it's not that he's not a threat on the champion, it's that he's not a threat to pick it. And that's because in White, he doesn't pick it and things have changed up. Maybe the coaching philosophy, how they use him in the team, contrasted with Blue, where he very much was a threat in all senses on Yasuo to pick it and play it. So, with all that said, since Jatt wants to cherry pick the exact Pawn Yasuo one, which in one sense I'm correct on, but in terms of the facts of who banned it, I'm absolutely wrong on. I have no problem saying that. I'm factually inaccurate there. Didn't look it up, obviously, or misremembered it. Maybe got Blue and White mixed up like I did before. So, with that said, there was another example later in the tournament where Jatt, when OMG was playing a game, said words to the effect that that Yasuo was a signature champion for Cool. Now, here's the key point here. Since he cherry-picked the Pawn Yasuo bit, I can now pick this part as well. I'm covering them all of it. Now, here's what's funny, is in the pick ban of Starhorn Royal Club versus OMG, in Game 1 of the semi-finals, Kobe actually mentioned that Cool had been talking about his problems with Yasuo at Worlds. So the fact that Jatt cited Yasuo as a signature for Cool is incredible, because actually Cool did barely ever play Yasuo, but what happened was, I think it was the regional, he had a crazy game, I think it was in the lower bracket, where he just super hard carried on the champion, went absolutely nuts and was insane on it, but that was like one of the only times he ever played, and that's one of the only really good games he had on the champion. So what's funny is, when we add these two pieces of information together, when we have grounds to think that Jatt didn't do a good job of explaining Pawn and Yasuo, and maybe it seems like he doesn't maybe know if Pawn's really good on Yasuo because he hadn't played it much in summer, even though he was a god in spring and before on it. It makes it seem like Jatt doesn't know that much about Pawn's Yasuo, tied with this fact, which is that Jatt certainly doesn't seem to understand that Cool is not a Yasuo player at all, and then has stated that Cool's a Yasuo player. Notice he doesn't address that himself in his twitlonger, conveniently forgets about all that. So if we tie that together, we can see why some people would then say, Jatt just says crazy random things about Korean and Chinese teams. Now, I don't think that's the case. I actually think he probably did know about Pawn and Yasuo on the other one, he just was inarticulate. I think he certainly didn't know about Cool and Yasuo though, and that he has overplayed his hand on how much LPL he knows there, and definitely how much research he did, and how many times Cool did or did not play Yasuo over that split. He definitely did not know that number. Well, I can't say definitely, but I would speculate that he did not know that piece of information. I think it's very unreasonable to suggest that he would have spoken that way if he in fact had. And so for Korea, sure, he was inarticulate. For LPL, for China, he certainly seems to not have just misspoken, but to be absolutely wrong, and in fact to have pretended to know information he doesn't know. Rather than just say, here's the key thing, because he probably did watch the regional of China and saw him play one game. Rather than just say, I saw a game he played in the regional where he was incredible on Yasuo, so maybe you can do that here. Instead, or maybe he'll pick it, instead he suggested that it's a signature champion and that it's a champion that he's very well known for. He's not. That was a one-off game. Now then, in terms of the concept and reasoning for the Jatt Dilemma being associated with Jatt, okay, here's the thing about Jatt that I want to get out, because it's actually a compliment, but then it also presents my problem with Jatt and why I've titled the video Darth Jatt's Dark Side Dilemma, because there's a different dilemma here for Jatt. So here's the thing. If we think of the NALCS casters and some of the other casters in the world, okay, so Freak has been around a long time, right? Problem with Freak is this guy just straight up drinks the Riot Kool-Aid. He's totally all in on that Riot mentality of how they think of the game and conceptualize the game and model the game for the viewer. And he uses very simplistic reasoning again and again. And it seems to switch depending on who he's talking about, but he always sticks with this simplistic reasoning when, quite frankly, it often feels a bit blinkered, even though other than that, seems like an all right guy. Jatt, unfortunately, though, is not from that camp, and he's not that type of person. Jatt actually seems like he should be the one who can bring balance to the Force. He can be a Riot caster in NALCS of all regions. That's like home territory for the Riot casters who drink the Kool-Aid. He can be in there, and yet he can also be the guy who's reasonable, who brings balance to the Force of the real thing, the real situation, and the fact that NA is not as good as Korea, especially in these seasons, but what is good about NA and what is bad about Korea. And he can be the guy who's the fulcrum, the one who around which everything moves. He can be the one who's reasonable and yet is deep within enemy territory and is part of the establishment very much. And in that sense, be one of the best casters of all time. Because this is a guy who is very intelligent. He's articulate. He's knowledgeable in many respects. Was a pro player, has watched pretty much all pro play in North America and EU. Now has watched a lot of Korea and educated himself in that particular sense. This guy should have been the chosen one. And yet, I have noticed this trend where he seems to be unduly worried about what the crowd thinks, and in terms of how he takes his knowledge and applies it, seems to take that mind, and sometimes he does seem to pander to the crowd, especially NA fans. And so it feels like he buys into that whole hype philosophy where in casting and the narratives that you use, you have to make people from NA who are fans there believe that their teams are better than they are, or ignore parts of the negatives. Not all of them, but just parts of them when you're setting them up against these impossible to beat Koreans, who in general, the best Koreans are that level above and are going to win out in those scenarios. And it feels like sometimes he tries too hard, disingenuously, to make the gap seem smaller, which is something, by the way, famously he said after many of the Worlds, that the gap's shrinking, etc. So this is one of the issues I have with him, because I think as good as he is, he could be so much more, and he could be more reasonable as well in his approach. I mean, there's a couple of other instances that I'll give where I feel like this is the problem that I see happening. So one of them was when TSM was playing against Samsung White. TSM goes down 0-2 and gets ultra shit stomped. The first two games are such brutal beatdowns that if you dislike TSM, which I don't personally, I dislike TSM fans, then this is like porn to you to watch these two games, because they get absolutely reamed the fuck out by Samsung White in the first two games of the quarterfinals of Season 4 Worlds. And two of the biggest beatdowns ever against a skilled team, put it that way. And yet, in Game 3, TSM wins after Samsung White gets even cockier in pick ban and does some crazy early strategy where they get behind, and TSM managed to win one game. Now, in this scenario, you need to set up the context that, like, TSM's absolutely been toyed with in the first two games, completely wrecked. Now they've won a game, but that's almost at the grace of it. Samsung White being so cocky, one of the cockiest pick bans we've ever seen, and then their initial approach. That's why TSM's back in the series, and you need to set up the context. It's probably not going to happen again in Game 4. Samsung White will just play normally in Game 4, and it's going to be hard for TSM to win. Rather than doing that, Jatt made this point, okay, on the broadcast. He said, if you can win one game, you can win 3. Now, this is an example of where I feel like Jatt is playing into the dark side. He knows, I feel like deep down, he knows that's a ridiculous statement, and that's a very disingenuous statement for this moment of the cast. Because actually, that doesn't make any sense logically, that if you can win one game, you can win 3 games. Sure, if we're not talking about this match that you're now addressing it in the context of, if you can win one game and you can play 300 games against Samsung White, yeah, you can win 3 games eventually. Now, problem is, what's the relevance of winning 3 games? Oh, you need to win 3 games to win a best of 5. But you're down 0-2, so you have to win 3 games. Not only that, forget win 3 games, you have to win 3 games in a row. Now, winning one game does not mean you can win 3 games in a row. Secondly, winning one game does not mean in a best of 5 against a team much better than you that you can win 3 of the 5 games, which is the key context that he ignored there. So while it might have been a throwaway simplistic line, I also feel like it was very disingenuous in terms of how it set it up to the audience. And unfortunately, whether correct or not, that seems to play into me, to my perception of Jatt, and the fact that sometimes he panders or is a little bit disingenuous in how he sets things up to the Western fans. The other example would be at MSI in 2015, where he made that, I can't remember if it was a tweet or I think it might be a tweet, where he says that TSM looked like they were tilted since Huni locked in Cassiopeia in like the first game of the tournament or something, and then that's why they went 1-4 or something ridiculous and only beat the wildcard team, like, or at least that was the implication. I mean, that's obviously a ridiculous statement because TSM went into the tournament considered like a top 5 team in the world, like an elite team in the world, and no elite team just because of one pick going totally out of askew of what they thought would happen and then being successful. Nobody gets tilted and just loses every other game to different opponents from all around the world. That's a ridiculous statement. And again, it felt like he was trying to downplay how much TSM had failed utterly and fallen from a very high position to the absolute doldrums of being terrible at that tournament, not even making the playoffs. So here's the thing. Come back to the light, Jatt. You have it within you. You are a very good caster. You don't have to do these aspects here. And you're so respected and you're so entrenched within Riot and within the casting community that you, of everyone, could get away with making more reasonable comments, even if the others are drinking the Kool-Aid in some set. So you know what? You might ask me, why do you have to confront him? Because there's good in him. I felt it. Now, here's the thing. I want to end this on a reasonable note. I mean, it's all been reasonable so far, but I mean, it's not going to be an aggressive ending. So there was a section in Jatt's twitlonger when he was addressing the Jatt Dilemma before. I want to read out here where he says, this was the one where I'd posted the incorrect information about the bans of blue against white. So I should mention that I don't want this to come across as any sort of attack or offensive on Thorin. He posted some bad information, as everyone who posts or frequently or talks frequently about League in the past 4 years, constantly, every day, will end up doing inevitably. The point I want to make is just to fact check and do your best to spread accurate information when possible. The fact that one tweet 1 year ago on information that was incorrect could morph into hundreds of comments cumulatively, as a reference that I and other casters don't know anything about Korea and China is disheartening. Anyway, that's all for now. I'm probably going to do more big blog-style rant/posts in the future just so I can express my opinions more often. See you guys next time. So, okay, first and foremost, really good point he makes there, which is that, yeah, when you talk and have to express opinions and do so in an impromptu manner and throwaway manner on Twitter, in videos, live, etc., not where you've got time to sit and think and all the rest of it, yeah, things are just going to come out and they're going to be expressed incorrectly and you're going to get your facts wrong and you're going to misremember things and you're going to say things that actually, if you sat down and someone asked, you really think that? You probably would say, oh, well, I don't actually, if I think about it for another minute, or if you give me another piece of information, nah, actually, don't agree with that at all. Absolutely, that's the case. That's the case with me. That's the case with Jatt, by the way, on some of the things he's mentioned here. With that said, he says here to fact check and make sure you spread accurate information and that's key because of the implications of what it can mean to someone's reputation. Sure, and I agree as well. That's why it's important to get the porn Yasuo thing correct. That one's a bit more tenuous, but definitely the cool Yasuo one. In that scenario, you're spreading misinformation because you haven't fact checked yourself. Now, again, not a huge deal. You came out with it in the scenario. You probably should have mentioned it a different way. Said it was a champion you saw a great game from him on. Okay, all great. We're not dragging anyone over the coals here necessarily. And as someone who spent a lot of time on air doing analysis for CSGO events, so I think I've done like 31 events or something. Yeah, you've got hours and hours to fill here. Stuff comes out incorrectly. It comes out differently than you thought. It comes out on the spot, not the way you thought it in your mind, but you don't have time to correct it, and you have to keep going with the show, and you have to just go like improv style, like, okay, just go with it. Now go to the next thing, and maybe I can correct it later, maybe I don't. With that said also, I also have some sympathy for Jatt from working with Riot. Like, it's not the most ideal job in the world in terms of like some of the restrictions placed on the content they can do and how they manage their own brands and what they can say publicly. These are all things I have a lot of sympathy for, actually. And in some sense, I feel sorry for him, and I hope that his situation improves. Now, when I originally made this video, it was, didn't make this video originally, I'm doing it now and it's live. So when I thought up the concept for the title of this video was actually after I was like annoyed at some of the sort of things I've mentioned before about Jatt with like the win one game versus Samsung White or the TSM being tilted. In those scenarios, I did the title because I was thinking like, oh, like one day maybe I'm going to have to wreck this guy because he does seem to like constantly use his fantastic talents to go towards this like disingenuous path where it's kind of bullshit. And I think I'm like against that philosophy. But as I said, it's more of a measured video. Like, I've thought about it more. I think he's come back from that cliff a little bit more. He has been a little bit more reasonable. And so now the dark side dilemma to me is just that he doesn't have to do that at all, in my opinion. He's got so much cachet as a caster. He can just be a sick caster, and he can get away with comments that are a little bit more harsh or a little bit more brutal than other people. And who gives a fuck what people ultimately are saying on Reddit in that scenario? It's not me saying all these comments. I don't post hundreds of comments. I can see why he might find it disheartening, but these things are going to happen. People say things about me that are incorrect all the time, mate, and misquote me all the time. Unfortunately, it's just the territory that comes, I mean, it's what comes with the territory of being in the position we're in, isn't it? So, with that said, I want to make one last point, which is a point that can apply to me and it can apply to Jatt, which is you should always be willing to admit when you are wrong, especially when it's not just that your opinion was a bit off or a bit skewed or whatever. That's one thing, because we can all have opinions, they can all be different, and they get different levels of how informed they are. But when you actually just factually correct, you've got to come out and admit it, which by the way, I don't think he's ever done the Yasuo thing for cool, but whatever. There's a great quote that says, to make a mistake is one thing, but to fail to correct it is to make another mistake. So, in this scenario, when you make a mistake, when you get called out on something, first of all, don't just cherry pick the one instance you were right in. Just admit when you were wrong and you were right in some areas as well. That's fine too. Also, don't aggressively go on the offensive like sometimes it seems like Jatt does. He's one of the worst for doing that, unfortunately, and sometimes being aggressive. Now, he wasn't in that twitlonger. He really came back from that. But in the past, when I was a less-known figure, it felt like, yeah, he was a bit aggressive in it, or he was a bit dismissive in how he phrased things himself, considering he wants to be very specific about what people said. So, okay, I thought this was an interesting video to make on this topic because it clears up a lot of things. You can link people here when they ask what the Jatt Dilemma is. It's got all the links to all the key ones. I think there were some other Jatt Dilemmas, but I forget exactly where they were. We have done like a bazillion episodes of Summoning Insight. So that's the Jatt Dilemma, and that's what I think about it.